Pro-life talk. Real-world answers. This is Life Report.
Welcome to Life Report. I am your host, Josh Brahm, and we are here with two special guests. We have Jonathan Keller, kind of a reoccurring guest person, political expert, local guy. He's the executive director of Right to Life of Central California, and my boss.
Just a humble political junkie. That's all I am.
That's all you are. A huge Hugh Hewitt fan.
Yes.
And reader of all things political blogs.
Yes, indeed.
And we have a special person coming back. He was actually on you're so special.
Special guest.
very, very special. For the diehard Life Report fans that have heard every single episode, gonna remember John Gerardi, Notre Dame now law student. I think before when we had you on, you were just Notre Dame student.
Yeah, just an undergrad.
Just an undergrad, and we had you on to talk about when President Obama was there giving the commencement address, and everyone was going crazy, and you were talking. We talked about both what the pro-lifers did to kind of protest this, as well as what President Obama said, and those were a couple of great shows. In fact, one of them I think was like the #1 episode that year.
Well,
naturally, and now John is a law student at Notre Dame, and we thought who better to talk about what happened yesterday, the Supreme Court decision on Obamacare, than a Notre Dame law student.
Wow, a Notre Dame law graduate? No, just that probably would have been better. But that's okay.
But the Supreme Court decided to rule this year.
It's the best I could get.
That's fine.
So John is, as I said, a Notre Dame law student. He is working this summer at the Fresno County District Attorney's Office, and we're going to be talking today both about kind of how what happened yesterday affects the pro-life community, as well as I want to kind of do a little bit deeper analysis of the actual decision than kind of the overview that everybody got yesterday. Yesterday.
Yeah.
So just to start us off, John, and this is the way we're going to do this. We have John and Jonathan. So John Gerardi and Jonathan Keller, and I'm going to try to keep that straight today.
Okay,
John, stated briefly, what happened yesterday?
Okay, yesterday the Supreme Court issued its ruling on the Affordable Care Act, which is the name for what we colloquially know as Obamacare.
Right.
So it looked at it focused on one of the central provisions of the act, which was the so-called individual mandate, which is the mandate that everyone in America needs to get health insurance in some way. So you either have to buy it yourself, you need to get it from an employer, you need to get it through some social governmental program like Medicare or Medicaid or something like that, or else you have to pay some sort of fine. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was constitutional and that therefore the bill as a whole stands. They dealt with a few ancillary things about how the state funding for Medicaid as part of the ACA, but that's sort of to the side of what we're wanting to address today, which is stuff that relates to the pro-life battle.
Yeah, and that's where I want to start. Before we do a kind of a deep analysis of what the Supreme Court was considering, let's kind of start with the narrow. How does this affect, our audience is particularly kind of pro-life activists, conservatives listening on the radio in Central California. So, Jonathan, why don't you kind of talk a little bit about how does the Obamacare legislation, I want to kind of focus more on the legislation versus what the Supreme Court did for this first part, because in the end, SCOTUS was ruling on this legislation that was given to them, passed by Congress, and heavily promoted by our president. So how does the Obamacare legislation promote abortion?
Well, I think it's pretty amazing. The scary thing is, to a certain degree, is that we probably don't even know all the dangers that this law has for pro-life advocates. The amazing thing, if any of you that are out there listening had a chance to hear the oral arguments from the case.
Our side totally won.
Well, but not only that, but Justice Scalia actually said at one point, the government was making a point of, he was trying to argue a point, and Justice Scalia actually said, you don't actually expect us to read this entire law, do you? And this is one of the chief justices of the highest court in the land. I'm sorry, one of the justices, the associate justices of the highest court in the land. And even he acknowledged and said that 2,700 pages is an obscenely long law to try and pass.
Right.
And the problem with that is that there's many different aspects that could probably be very insidious in the future, but we know of at least really 3 areas that are really going to be detrimental to pro-lifers. And if we have time, I'll get into the second 2. But very briefly, number 1, they have several very problematic provisions with respect to federal funding of elective abortion. Number 2, Obamacare offers little, if any, conscience protection to employers and doctors. And number 3, this is something that has received very little coverage among most pro-life groups, but Obamacare creates what's called the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which popularly known as not IPAD, but IPAB, IPAB.
Right.
And if we have time, I'll get into that. Wesley Smith from the Secondhand Smoke blog with First Things, he's done a lot of great writing on this. But pro-lifers a lot of times are very concerned about abortion, which I think this bill, there's no doubt it has a lot to do with abortion. But on the flip side of life, on the end-of-life issues, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, it's really a mouthful, it really...
That's why Palin calls it death panels for short, right?
That's more,
basically what we're talking about, right?
That's the thing, is that it essentially is. Sarah Palin got ridiculed a lot for calling it death panels, but more or less that's basically what it is. It's talking about rationing care in an effort to bring costs down. And if we have time, we can talk about that later, but I know we've got a lot to cover today.
Yeah, so well, let me just ask you a follow-up question before I jump to John. A lot of people would take a look at this and they would listen, let's say people in the middle or maybe even on the pro-choice side, would hear pro-lifers saying that a health care bill promotes abortion and feel like, well, wait a minute, it's just, we're just talking about more affordable health care. So just help connect the dots for people. How does why would it be possible that after this that the abortion rate might actually go up for the first time since 1990?
Well, there's at least 3 reasons. Again, out of 2,700 pages, we may be able to find more, but there's at minimum at least 3 reasons. Number 1, a lot of this analysis, by the way, we'll link to it in the show notes, but it comes from a Heritage Foundation study. Section 1303 of the Affordable Care Act gives massive federal subsidies to private health care plans that cover elective abortions. Basically, one of the ways that they're trying to make health care affordable, as in Affordable Care Act, is that they are subsidizing plans in some states through health insurance exchanges so that it's easier for people to buy health insurance. And there would be federal funds that would go to these plans that would help cover abortions. Now, this is where it gets to be a little bit of a shell game where they say, well, no, the money wouldn't actually be used for abortion. It would just cover those plans. But it becomes really kind of a shell game. Money is really fungible. And this section, 1303 of Obamacare, specifically circumvents the Hyde Amendment, which normally bars any federal funds from paying for abortions. Number 2, Section 1101 gives the Health and Human Services Secretary, in this case, at least through November, Kathleen Sebelius, the discretion to allow high-risk insurance pools to cover abortion. There's currently no legislative, executive, or judicial requirement that this is prevented. And as a result, it could go on in any administration now or in the future. Basically, those high-risk insurance pools are going to be created as a result of the Affordable Care Act to try and allow people that have pre-existing conditions to obtain coverage. But again,
to jump in, what you were saying about, we don't know exactly what's in, that's the reason why, is because so much power is delegated to federal executive agencies and to federal executive officers, and they have leeway to decide, well, we're going to do, pay for this, we'll pay for that, we won't pay for this, we won't pay for that. So that's what John means. It's not from lack of us, it's not from lack of pro-lifers reading it, it's from all these decisions can be made by the Secretary of Health and Human Services to fund abortion more.
Right.
Well, and on that point, that's the third point, at least that Heritage mentioned specifically, was Section 10503. Section 10503 directly appropriates $11 billion over 5 years to underwrite the operation and construction of community health centers. Now, these funds are not subject to the Hyde Amendment, and while President Obama issued an executive order, many of you remember that was the big deal that got Bart Stupak and all the pro-life Democrats to come on board. He issued an executive order 13535 to basically try and assure that the funds are going to be safe.
Which was a joke.
It essentially...
it wasn't legally enforceable or anything like that.
It's entirely discretionary, and it's subject to reversal by either an executive decision or by judicial overview. So anybody within the Health and Human Services Department could essentially say, you know what, we're going to decide that we actually want to build. I mean, literally, you could look at this and say the fact that it's a community health center, a group like Planned Parenthood could apply and say, you know what, look, we're building these health centers in low-income neighborhoods. Yeah. And the sad thing is, many of our listeners know that there are some services that Planned Parenthood provides that are completely legitimate.
Right.
Pap smears, cervical cancer screenings, all sorts of things like that. The scary thing is that this money, this $11 billion, could build hundreds of new Planned Parenthood clinics, and then they would be able to go out independently and get grants to cover only the abortions. And they'd be able to say, oh, well, look, no federal money is funding abortion. But the reality is that if you build a clinic that is going to be performing abortions with federal money that wasn't there before, I'm sorry, you're funding abortion.
Right. Anything to add before I move on to the next topic?
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay.
So.
Okay. One of the things that I want to talk just briefly, and I did this in one previous episode, but this is worth repeating. We have to understand this. Clearly, many Catholics are very concerned about this because of the problem of this funding contraceptives. Mm-hmm. And a lot of Protestants aren't so concerned about that because they don't have the same theological concerns about contraceptives that Catholics do. So I want to bridge the gap here and say there's something here that both sides absolutely need to be concerned about, and that's Ella, which is kind of the new quote-unquote called contraceptive, but it's not. I want to explain why, because it's always mixed. You're like, Ella and the morning after pill and birth control pills. No. Ella's not at all the same. Ella is more closely connected to RU46 than birth control pills, because Ella, unlike birth control pills, is a progesterone antagonist. The only other progesterone antagonist on the market is RU46. It's the abortion pill, okay? And I have an actual study. This is from Human Reproductive Update, and I'm going to link to this on the website, but I'm just going to read just a couple of sentences. This is them talking about how RU46 and other progesterone antagonists, what they do with the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. This is a couple of sentences. They say mifepristone, or RU46, and other progesterone antagonists also have contraceptive potential. They may act by several mechanisms. At low doses, they inhibit ovulation by blocking the LH surge. Low doses also retard endometrial development by virtue of their anti-proliferative action. As a consequence, the endometrium cannot support implantation. That is an abortifacient. That's like a very late-term working birth control pill, but it actually, there's like no question. This is not like birth control pills where I think there's legitimate discussion that can be had on what is the cause and effect relations between birth control pills and the endometrium. We don't really know. There's research on both sides, and hopefully we'll talk about that more one day. Mm-hmm. Ella's not like that. Ella is as clear as we can get right now, and Protestants and Catholics would both be very, very concerned about that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to actually make one point on that. The reason that that's not one of the main issues that I even brought up in regards to abortion is because I wanted to focus specifically just on surgical abortion itself.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing is that all of these concerns that Heritage wrote about, this was actually written back in November before Secretary Sebelius issued the HHS mandate, which I know some of our listeners, I don't want to get too technical, but I know they can get a little bit confused sometimes. Well, what's the difference between the individual mandate and the HHS mandate?
Well, the government can issue different kinds of mandates for different kinds of things.
Right.
The individual mandate is a requirement of the Affordable Care Act that everyone has to buy health insurance. Everyone has to get health insurance. People colloquially refer to the HHS mandate as referring to one of the gazillions of mandates that HHS actually issues, which is requiring employers to cover things like contraceptives, like abortifacient, so-called contraceptives. So it's not really very precise language to just call it the HHS mandate. The HHS issues a gazillion mandates, and different government agencies issue mandates all the time. This mandate, the one that people are concerned about, is really the anti-conscience mandate, perhaps we could start calling it, or something like that.
Okay.
So that's kind of the different. People should sort of keep that in mind.
Okay.
Those are two different things.
Before we get into the deeper analysis on this decision, I want to keep us moving. I just want to make one, Life Report is a lot about communication and how pro-lifers should communicate with both other pro-lifers as well as especially the people in their sphere of influence that may not be pro-life. And there's several things that, we were up, from very early in the morning till late at night working, and part of my work was in the social media end of this. One of the things that I saw a lot, I just want to encourage people not to do, okay? Because I know there's a lot of people that are very upset, and I think there's a lot of reasons to be upset. That's fine. That's good for us to know enough about this decision to be able to be upset and hopefully knowledgeable about it. The kind of meme going around was, oh boy, everyone's a constitutional scholar immediately, which is not true. But what I saw a lot of was people making these kind of very broad assumptions about Chief Justice Roberts and his intelligence. Like, this idiot, I can't believe he would do this. Whereas Hugh Hewitt, who's one of the smartest people I know of, is like, Roberts is way smarter than I am, right?
Yeah.
Or his intentions, and he was trying to do this, or he was trying to. It's like, you can't know these things. So I want to encourage people, back off on that. Let's read the decision, try to understand it, and remember. And this is something that Hewitt said that I really agreed with. And I know I got flack on Facebook for saying this, but I don't care. I think it took a lot of courage for Roberts to do what he did. If he believes what he did, which I believe he does, then it would have been way easier to just side with the conservatives and go kind of the obvious route, which is what gives me the same pause that it gave Hewitt. That it's like, yeah, this guy really believes this. He definitely doesn't believe that this works under the Commerce Clause, but he believes that they do have the right to make this a tax, and he went the hard direction, I think, and I see this as a matter of integrity, and I know we can still disagree with it, like radically disagree with it, but I'm just sick of people calling this guy an idiot when he's not.
No. Yeah. I would agree with that, John.
All right, let's go to analysis. Let's bring the Notre Dame law student in, help us understand what were the constitutional issues that were examined.
All right, so there were kind of 3, but maybe more like 2.5 issues that were looked at. First, the focus was on the individual mandate. Is this constitutional? And there were 3 justifications given for the idea that you can make people buy health insurance if they don't want to. So the 3 justifications are, first, the Commerce Clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, that says the federal government has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. Number 2, which is sort of related to it, is the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Congress can make any laws that are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers that are already invested in the government by the Constitution. And the third justification was under the government's taxing power.
Right.
So because the government has pretty wide latitude to tax people for things.
Right.
So they said, well, this ruling that you have to buy health insurance or else you pay a fine, well, this is really a tax. So those were the 3 arguments that were put forward. Now, the opponents of the ACA argued, okay, first of all, yes, Congress can regulate commerce that's sort of interstate, but what's going on here is you're regulating the decision of people not to buy health insurance.
Right.
So that's not interstate commerce. That's interstate non-commerce.
Right.
You're just sort of sitting
anti-commerce.
So you can't really regulate someone for not doing something. And a majority of the justices on the Supreme Court agreed with that.
Right.
Similarly, the proponents of the Affordable Care Act said, well, the individual mandate is necessary for the whole structure of the ACA to continue to exist, because if you don't require everyone to buy health insurance, and you say, well, people with pre-existing conditions, so people who already are sick with something like diabetes or leukemia or something, if you only buy health insurance when you get sick and then you drop your health insurance after you get better, insurance companies can't make money.
Right.
So the Obama administration instituted this individual mandate so that, okay, people have health insurance for the duration, and it winds up, the insurance companies are able to make money, and this is fiscally allowable. So they said, oh, this is necessary and proper for attaining this goal of Congress. And the court disagreed with that too. They said, well, it's necessary for attaining that goal, but it's not proper. It's not based in some existing power that the federal government has under the Constitution. So because the court had held this is not commerce.
Right.
You can't regulate something that isn't commerce. You can't regulate inactivity.
Right.
They said, nope, this is not proper. It might be necessary, but it's not proper, and it's not justified by that part of the Constitution. Then the third justification was the taxation power. And Justice Roberts joined with the four, traditionally considered liberals on the court in saying that, yes, this individual mandate is a tax, even though, as the dissent pointed out, look, this doesn't look like a tax. This is a mandate that thou shalt buy health insurance that has a penalty attached to it. Right. If you don't, pay this fine. And we'll have sort of a sliding scale of how much you have to pay, and you got to pay it to the IRS. But it's still, just because there's a sliding scale of how much you have to pay based on your income, and just because you have to pay to the IRS, that doesn't change the nature of this thing. This is still a mandate and a penalty. It's not a tax. And yet, Justice Roberts, what strikes me, now admittedly, I am not as smart as John Roberts, but through what I think is not very great reasoning, analogized it to other things that weren't called taxes, but which in fact were. I mean, this wasn't called a tax, and I don't think it is a tax in terms of its form.
Right.
So as a result of that, because the federal government has broad a latitude to levy taxes, the individual mandate was upheld. Now, because the individual mandate was upheld, pretty much everything else in the Affordable Care Act was also upheld. If the dissent had won, they argued, well, the Affordable Care Act is so central, we can't really distinguish it from the rest of this
Right.
bill, and we should throw the entire thing out. So really, we were just on the hair's edge.
Yeah.
If Roberts had ruled with the conservatives, with Alito,
Right.
Kennedy, Scalia, and Thomas, the whole bill would have gone away, along with all of the funding for abortion, all of our concerns about the lack of conscience protections for employers providing insurance for doctors, everything, all of these bad things that are in the law, they all would have gone away.
Right.
But instead, they're all still here, and we still have to deal with all of it.
One of the frustrating things for me, and this is one of the messages I kept on kind of on yesterday on Facebook and Twitter and stuff, is that, and I wasn't the only one remotely, but is Obama kept calling this not a tax.
Yeah.
Well, that's the amazing thing about it is that Obama insisted it wasn't a tax. The text of the bill itself doesn't really refer to it as a tax. It says this is a mandate and this is a penalty that you pay. And I mean, the Supreme Court has traditionally had a distinction between it separated what is a tax and what is a penalty. Right. So it was only when it got to litigation that they began arguing it as a tax. And in every lower court before the Supreme Court, every judge who heard it, every court that heard it,
Right.
rejected the argument that this was a tax. Even the more liberal courts
Right.
that heard it.
Even,
it was only
Paul Clement barely even talked about it during oral arguments.
I think in the dissent they noted that they spent 50 words in oral arguments, 6-hour-long oral arguments, and just a very, very short amount of time.
This is frustrating to me that the government could even argue, this backup argument that they could even bring that into discussion.
And for other purposes of the litigation, they'd argued that it wasn't a tax in order to get it before the court. But then for this part, now it is a tax.
Right.
So I mean it's a lot of verbal daring do going on. So.
All right, we're going to do some special content that we're going to record in a couple of minutes. We're going to be releasing some of that, but I've got to kind of wrap up for this show.
Okay.
So let me just jump to what can we do to fix things.
Okay, what we can do to fix things. Well, we've sort of exhausted some of our legal options. Our legal attempts to get rid of the whole of the health care bill,
Right.
That's pretty much over. Well, now there are
lawsuits
that are matriculating through that are specifically challenging the religious liberty, the anti-conscience mandates
Right.
issued by HHS, and hopefully those things might get overturned. But really, I would say for any Christian listening that I think the two most important things are vote and pray. And if a new president is elected, we could potentially overthrow the whole bill. And if you have a pro-life president in office, most of these things we were talked about how executive agencies can make all of these decisions for conscience things, for what sorts of things get covered under these plans. All of those things, if you put in a pro-life president, he can have his executive officers make those decisions under his authority. So, if a pro-life president is elected, overnight, a lot of the bad stuff that's in the Obamacare bill would go away.
Right.
Now, probably not everything, but a lot of it would go away.
Right.
So,
jump in here.
I'll say, again, I think the biggest thing that we can do as pro-life people, Right to Life of Central California is not a partisan organization, but I really do think that we should have people go back. I'm sure we're going to link to it, but
Should pro-lifers always vote for the pro-life candidate?
Yes.
Was the episode. Scott Klusendorf was on with Jonathan and myself and discussing about the general topic and so we will link to, if you just go to prolifepodcast.net and you can look that up. Should pro-lifers always vote for the pro-life candidate? I think is really important for people to listen to.
And I would say again, we're not a partisan organization, but it is vitally important that every single pro-life person in the country votes for the candidate that is going to repeal and replace Obamacare. And I think one thing, I heard a press conference the other day that was really good. It was actually Governor Brahm, I'll say his name. He said that the only way at this point for us to repeal Obamacare is to replace President Obama. And I think that's what we have to do.
Okay, John Gerardi is a Notre Dame law student. He is available for hire. So if you want to hire this guy,
please,
preferably for legal work.
Yeah, for legal work. Not for yard work or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I'll take that.
You can email me, Josh at prolifepodcast.net if you're interested in getting in touch with John, and I will get in touch with
or jgerardi at nd.edu.
Jonathan Keller is the Executive Director of Right to Life of Central California. Thank you both for coming on and talking about this. If you want to hear the special content the bonus content that we're about to shoot as we continue to talk about this issue, go to prolifepodcast.net. That's our show. Thanks for watching. Have a great week.
You've been watching Life Report, Pro-Life Talk, Real World Answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.